So last week we were looking at ecosystems, and we found out that an ecosystem has two main parts to it. It has abiotic factors and biotic factors. The abiotic factors were the non-living things in the ecosystem. So what is the type of land? What is the temperature? If it's aquatic, is it saltwater or fresh water? What's the humidity? So all of the non-living things. And then the biotic factors were all of the living things in the ecosystem. So all of the plants and the animals that are there. This week, what we'll be looking at is energy. So first of all, our first lesson will look at how does energy get into an ecosystem? And then our second level, or our second lesson, will look at how energy moves throughout the ecosystem. All right, so why is energy important? Well, energy is involved in every activity on Earth. Anytime you see a plant growing, it is absorbing energy. Anytime you move your arm, you are using energy. You're converting chemical energy that's stored in your body from the food that you eat, and you're turning it into kinetic energy, moving energy. So anytime something moves or breathes or grows, it's using some sort of energy. And almost all of the energy on Earth comes from the sun. It comes from sunlight being absorbed by the Earth or the things on the Earth. There is a small amount of energy on Earth that comes from inside of the Earth. So the Earth's core is very dense, and there's materials that are moving past each other that are causing friction, and they heat up. So if you dig down deep into the Earth, it gets quite warm. So there's a small amount of energy from the friction and the pressure inside of the Earth, and also from radioactive materials decaying inside deep in the Earth. But that's a very small amount. Almost all of the energy is coming from the sun. And it travels here through sunlight. Right? Sunlight is photons, and those photons travel from the sun and hit the Earth. All right, so what happens when sunlight hits the Earth? Let's see. Some of the sunlight comes in, and about 30% of the light is actually reflected. So it hits the atmosphere and it just reflects back out into space, and it does nothing. 19% of the energy is absorbed by the atmosphere. Remember, Earth is surrounded in this blanket of gases called the atmosphere. Mostly nitrogen, but there's also some oxygen, some carbon dioxide, and other gases in there. And those gases will actually absorb some of that energy. And this is what allows wind to occur. Right? If some parts of the Earth absorb more light energy, they'll heat up, and then other parts will be cooler, and then as soon as you have hot and cold areas, your gases will start to move, and that's what causes wind. "51% of the light energy is absorbed by the land and the water, so the oceans, lakes. So this energy, it keeps the Earth a livable temperature, but it also allows things like the water cycle to occur. So when this light energy hits the ocean, for example, it allows some water to be evaporated. That water moves up to the atmosphere, it cools down, and eventually rains somewhere else. So in this case, that energy is allowing the water cycle to occur. That water cycle is important for all living things. And only 0.02% of the energy, so far less than 1% of the energy that's hitting the Earth from the sun, far less than 1% of the sunlight, is actually absorbed by plants. So if you think about every single plant on Earth, every blade of grass, tree, bush, all of those combined are only absorbing 0.02% of the sunlight that's hitting Earth. And that sunlight is what's allowing those plants to grow. So if you think about the amount of sunlight and the amount of energy that's hitting the Earth from the sun, it's such a huge amount of energy. And that's what allows all of the processes on Earth that allow life to survive here. And only a small fraction, way less than 1% of that sunlight, is actually being used by plants to grow. But that tiny percent is super important, because when plants absorb sunlight, that's what brings energy into an ecosystem. And it brings it in by something called photosynthesis. All right, so what does photosynthesis do? Photosynthesis transforms light energy, sunlight, into chemical energy, and it turns it into glucose, which is sugar. And this is done by plants. So any plant that you see growing, it is turning light energy into chemical energy, into sugar. So it's done by any plant, and we call plants producers. And that's because the plants are creating a physical thing. They're creating sugar out of it. So they're producing sugar. So any plant, tree, bush, grass, those are all producers, and they are doing photosynthesis. We've seen this chemical reaction before. Photosynthesis is a chemical reaction. It takes light energy, sunlight, carbon dioxide out of the air, water, and it combines all of those things. And if a plant has all of those things, then this chemical reaction will happen. So the atoms will break apart from each other and rearrange, and they will form glucose, sugar, and it will emit oxygen. So during a day, plants are able to do this. This is beneficial because this is how plants bring energy into an ecosystem, because they just turned light energy into a physical thing, into sugar, a solid object, sugar that other things can eat. So this is how the energy was brought into the ecosystem. Photosynthesis also has other benefits because it takes carbon dioxide and it turns it back into oxygen, and living things like us need, right, animals need oxygen. All right, there's another reaction, which is actually the exact same chemical reaction, but it's just backwards. And we call that cellular respiration. So what cellular respiration does is it just does this reaction backwards. It takes chemical energy, glucose, and it turns it into usable energy. Exact same reaction, I've just changed the arrow. Wrote it the other way around. And this is done by most living things. So for example, we do cellular respiration. We take the glucose that we get from eating things like plants, and we take oxygen that we breathed in. And if we have both of those things, we can do cellular respiration. And our body does that reaction, and we breathe out carbon dioxide and water vapor, and we get some energy back from it. That energy allows us to make heat to keep our body warm and move ourselves and do everything we need to survive. So our body is constantly doing this by breaking down the food and getting the glucose out of it and doing this reaction, and it's producing energy that we use. And pretty much all animals do this. And plants also do this. So at nighttime, when there's no sun out, how does a plant survive through the night? Well, it does this as well. It takes glucose that it has stored up during the day, and it breaks it back down and creates usable energy. So plants and animals do this. We call these two reactions, we call them complementary processes because they are the same chemical reaction, just in opposite directions. Now I just want to show you a couple of different pictures here. So, as you've probably noticed, most plants involve some sort of green leaf or some part of them that's green. And the reason for that is that the plants have a special chemical in them called chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is a chemical, it's a pigment that makes plants green. And it's also a chemical that allows plants to do photosynthesis. So this material, this chlorophyll chemical, what it does is it actually absorbs all of the colors of light except for green. So when light hits these plants, the red and the blue light is all absorbed by the plant, and it allows the plant to do photosynthesis. And the only thing that this chlorophyll doesn't absorb is green light. It reflects green light. And that's why you see green when you look at a plant, because green light was reflected off the plant and everything else was absorbed. And that's what allows it to do photosynthesis. This over here is a picture taken through a microscope of a plant leaf. And each one of these things is a plant cell. So that's one cell of my plant leaf. And inside of it, you notice all these little green blobs. Those little green blobs, those are structures called chloroplasts. And this is the part of the plant cell that actually makes chlorophyll. So those little globs, they're tiny pieces, they make chlorophyll, that's why they're green, and those little pieces in there are absorbing all of the sunlight except for green light. They're reflecting green light that we see, the rest gets absorbed, it is used by the plant to do photosynthesis, and now that plant cell can start to make sugar and store that sugar up. But the main thing here is that photosynthesis is what brought energy into the ecosystem. Now that that plant has sugar inside of it, now there's energy in the ecosystem. Other things can eat that plant and get that sugar and get that energy, and it can move throughout the ecosystem.